then once you get the rhythm of it, you begin to understand what the hell's going on.
What's the most memorable conversation or experience you've had with Joyce? So I know Siobhan's. Maybe yours is the same, but I don't know.
Most memorable. Molly's yes.
Okay. And why is that? Why does that stand out?
Molly's yes is the most romantic yes ever. Okay.
Okay.
Like, from what she says in it all, okay. And you realize that she's actually dreaming. Okay.
Okay.
So when she's it's the end of the book, right? So, okay, and she's dreaming, and like, it's a yes, right? And you probably know that passage, I would say. Okay. It's incredibly romantic. It's very Irish. It's also very pregnant, okay? Because you realize, if you know Joyce, okay, that Finnegans Wake is birthed out of Molly's yes. Okay. So, like, I just think that it's probably the best yes ever.
Wow, right? The best yes ever.
So, it's very poignant in our relationship, because she kind of clinched me with Molly's yes.
Oh my God. I mean, do you want to I would love to hear more about that, but whatever you guys want to share.
So would she.
But that's kind of like, well, Shiv, why don't you tell her?
Well, Shelby's had a little, but I'd love to hear your version. She's heard my version. It doesn't matter if they're completely disparate.
I feel like it'd be very Joycean if they were like, oops.
Like, the whole thing is that I did like I heard you read Molly's yes before you ever recited it to me, but you did recite it to me at one point, and it was just like, yeah, okay, we're gonna go with this one, right? And so, like, that kind of happened, and it's really funny because Joyce is very special to us, because, like, we had a lot of things planned, like, in COVID with non-COVID methods still. And so we were trying to get married on Bloomsday, and like, that didn't happen because of COVID. And so, like, there's been a lot of things with us that's been pushed down the road, but then what kind of keeps us, I think, on track with each other is Molly's yes. So it's really, like, it's just very special for us, right? Yeah, that's about all I have to say about that.
Wow, that's amazing. No, that's fantastic. I feel like, I don't know, I remember when I like first got to the end of Ulysses, I was a lot more, I don't know, I think I just didn't understand it, and I thought it was all about like, oh, like, because women like yield, and so, because I think Joyce said, right, that like yes is a very like feminine word, and I kind of didn't like that, but I am very glad to have this much better understanding of it. So good. But
I think if you go back and read it again, you'll see the Irish in it, because have you ever lived in Ireland?
No.
Okay, so it's funny, because you see, because it was a colonized country, okay, and the British were quite brutal, okay, the men were kind of emasculated. The women, on the other hand, because they were women, could get away with stuff with the British, okay. So very often the women became the vocal kind of mouthpiece of a family or something, right? So that's in the culture. right?
Okay. Mm-hmm.
And I think if you go back and read Molly's Yes, you'll see, oh my God, she's in complete control here, right?
Okay.
And it's kind of, I mean, that's how I read it anyway, you know.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's my answer to most memorable.
It makes me think of what you were saying, because I mean, I don't know if you're familiar with the Brehon Laws, Shelby. Have you heard about these?
No.
They were the laws, the legal system that was in place before Cromwell's colonization, planting of Ireland, had been in place for hundreds and hundreds of years. It was a system of laws called the Brehon Laws, within which men and women had, I don't want to say equal stature, but equivalent stature. And for example, even within the hierarchy of authority, parallel with the kings were the poets. So poets and kings had equal authority, respect, in the highest of highs and the holiest of holies, where the poets came first. And the poets, not only as the keepers of the stories and the keepers of the laws, but also the expressors of them and the advisors of the kings. So the word poet encompassed much, much more than a creator of, poet as we know it today. And within that law, there were very specific laws that allowed women, for example, when it came to romance or marriage or the marriage bed, a man could not divorce his wife for pretty much any reason. It was very hard for a man to divorce his wife, but a woman could divorce her husband if he wasn't providing whatever she needed within the marriage bed, or if she saw him as less than worthy in intellectual terms or whatever. So women had a much greater say in how things were run. So men had their set of response. So it was very different. And I think that permeates so much of what abides still within culture. As Tad was saying, through colonization, I mean, when you think of sort of the archetypical Irish women of legend, Queen Maeve and everything else, they were very much who was supposed to have gone into battle in the throes of childbirth and gave birth on the battlefield and carried on,
Wow.
So as Tad was saying, because of how things transpired with the British, there was a natural bent or a leaning or a fearlessness that allowed women to be more vocal. And so when we move through Molly's Yes, there's not only the reflective yes, as she sort of reaffirms her own thoughts and goes through her own memories of past lovers and past lives lived and everything else. We know also in the context of having just bedded Blazes Boylan and, her husband's out there, that there's a reaffirmation of the love and the oneness of the two of them. And as Tad said, the drifting off to sleep. Yes, there's this sort of reliving of the orgasmic yes, but also the submission to her own processes, to sort of entering that feminine spiral of thought and creation and everything else that is not a submission in any negative way. It's a surrendering into rather than a surrendering
of
anything. At least that's how I see it. And so in that, yes, I think these were conversations that Tad and I had early on that have come to what I was saying to you on our last conversation about, sometimes getting to points where it's not clear what's art and what's life, and it doesn't really matter, because the more one becomes the other, the more beautiful it all becomes. And how it's, once one enters into the very notion of making life your art or making your art your life, it's impossible to tell the dancer from the dance, as Yeats said. You can't, getting very esoteric here. Tad, bring me back to earth.
Yes, no, I agree with all of that. And if you think about women's power, it has always been seated in procreation in a lot of ways. And when you realize that that's the end of the book, and it leads naturally into Finnegans Wake, and that Finnegans Wake is a creation, right, of sorts. Okay, so it's a child, right? Okay, so you have to be mindful of that, like in the end of Ulysses, that it births something.
Oh,
okay?
Wow.
Okay, so I think that's, yeah, we covered that. Really. You know, I will say one thing, like, you know, everyone always says like Ulysses is incomprehensible. Okay, can't read it, too hard. What is it? Where's it going? You know, and everyone's always like that about Ulysses, right? I struggled with Ulysses for a long time, years.
Wow. Okay.
And when I met PJ, and he was doing readings, okay, there was no Sweeney's. He was a bard. He gave readings in pubs. We met at pubs where Joyce had drank. Okay.
Fantastic.
And I never really understood Ulysses until I heard it read aloud. And the secret to understanding Ulysses is you have to read it loud. Okay. You really, like, that is not so much in the Dubliners and Portrait of the Artist and the earlier things, but in Ulysses and Finnegans Wake as well. They are meant to be read aloud, because you then begin to understand what it is. And it's really, you know, a 400-page prose poem, right?
Wow. Okay.
But it's meant to be heard, because Ireland's all about the banter.
Okay.
And when it's read aloud, you get that, and you get the rhythm of it. And then once you get the rhythm of it, you begin to understand what the hell is going on. Okay? But which, if you're reading it silently, you can't.
No.
It's like, wait a second, where am I? And like, it really needs to be oral and experienced orally.
Okay.
And in that, you get, you know, all of Irish culture is there, right?
Okay.
So that's why it's such a great work. Okay.
I think, and you nailed it when you say that all of Irish culture is there, because when you consider that, again, from Cromwell onwards, there was no, I mean, the language of the everyman outside of the cities was Irish. And Irish was eventually practiced under pain of death, basically. I mean, you know, you couldn't have mass, couldn't teach, couldn't write Irish, couldn't, you know, so the tradition, the oral tradition, which was already an aspect of culture because it wasn't a literary tradition for a long time, that oral tradition is sort of, one wonders, because nothing is haphazard with Joyce. There's a sense at the more you unpack, the more you start to demystify everything within the books and the works, the more one understands that everything was intentional. And this is the brilliance of this man's mind and his representation of Irishness in all its contradictions, is that by engaging in the oral tradition, finding the music and the accents, because the different characters all have different accents, which needs must be read to different rhythms with different music. And that's, you know, how each episode has its own rhythm and music and form within musical form, but also within the spontaneous improvisational form. And so, as Tad says, one hears the rhythm of the oral tradition and also the words, you know, the confusion of language. What's Irish, what's English, what's invented, what matters, you know, and then the Turkish and the Arabic and the Russian and all the other languages.
Well, that all comes in Finnegans Wake, you see, because he then pushes like Ulysses is in a way, it's a microcosm. It's Irish society, but then Finnegans Wake gets much more international, and there's bits of Finnegans Wake that you read, and you're like, "What is this? It's gobbledygook," and then you realize that it's French, and he's just phonetically spelling French or Turkish or some other language, right?
Wow.
But you like you'll read that, like you'll look at it, and if you don't read it out loud, it just looks like gobbledygook on the page, right? And so it doesn't register in your mind until you start reading it out loud, and then you wait a second, I'm speaking French. It's really that's what it's about, right? So,
I think it's also because when you're reading aloud, you're forced to go with the rhythm of breath. You cannot read, like when he does the word for thunder, that I will not quote. Theoretically, it can be done in one breath, but in order to do that, you have to take a thunderous inhalation, and it creates that like split second of electricity just before a thunderclap, where everything stands still. We talk about, there's no bird song. When thunder actually breaks, there is absolute silence. And in order to express that word, you've got to have that moment of absolute intake and tension in order to go, get it out, whatever the word is that I won't find.
Wow. Oh my God.
And that's constant through it. And so as you're listening and as the rhythms, and it's how also, because every time you read it, it's a different story, because depending on the voices in the room reading the different passages, you're always hearing different emphases. And they sort of, those are revealing any individual's personal experience of life and language and reading and everything else. And so within that sort of, the meaning you receive or the understanding you receive of the words becomes different every time, at least for me.
No, I feel that same way. I was like, the first time that you approached like Ulysses or Finnegans Wake, were you reading it alone or with a group? Because I found like the first time I went for both of them, it was alone. But since then, I've reread certainly Ulysses with like multiple different groups. And it's just, I find like that has been so important to like even being able to get through it, but then also like actually like interiorizing it is having other people be a part of the text.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's because the characters are so like, disparate, right? They're everywhere. And like what's really in Sweeney's, when there were readings in Sweeney's, okay, like, you'd show up, there'd be 25 people, right? And you'd like, everybody reads a page. And sometimes the way the pages would fall, you get the right accent from the right Irish person reading that page, right? And it really coalesces your understanding of what's happening, right? Because Ireland is all about the banter, always, right?
Okay.
They didn't have much else. Do you know what I mean? Like materially, like a lot of people didn't have much more than like themselves and the clothes they stood up in. So like, they like what you were as a person was incredibly important, your character, and to this day, like in Ireland, people respect the character. Okay. And they put up with their eccentrics and their people that aren't the full shilling, and because it's cultural, right?
Okay.
Because nobody had, a lot of people had just subsistence living, right? And so like everything that made them human, right, was who they were as an individual, right?
Wow.
So, and that's reflected in the writing. So anyway. Okay, I have a question for you. Favorite Dubliners story?
Oh my gosh. That's a hard one. I have to think. Siobhan, do you have one? You can buy me some time. Jeez.
There are passages.
Oh, okay.
I know Tad's favorite. Well, why don't you go ahead and tell her why that's your favorite?
I love Ivy Day in the committee room.
Oh,
right?
So good. So good.
Because it's so good, and it's so, I think it's such a great departure point for really understanding modern Ireland, right?
Okay.
Because it's political, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I love that story. Do you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And it really, like, so much of what happened with Parnell,
Mm-hmm.
okay, is truly Irish. Do you know what I mean? In
Mm-hmm.
that, like, the church destroyed him,
Mm-hmm.
right? And nevertheless, he was revered, right? So I don't know. I find so much of that story just so indicative to my experience of living in the country for 22 years.
Wow.
And what's important to know, Shelby, is
mm-hmm.
I grew up, spent the first 20 years of my life growing up Catholic, Irish, and Tad moved to Ireland in his early 20s.
No, 30s.
30s, but lived 20 years in Ireland. And his experience was, at least begun with and permeate, was moving as part of the Anglo-Irish community, which was a very different experience and not opposing, but parallel. And so often we'll have discussions about something, and Tad's perspective as learning Ireland, like living there the same number of years as me, but as
mm-hmm.
an adult, as opposed to growing up there,
mm-hmm.
and as a member of the Anglo-Irish community, which is very different, right? And by Anglo-Irish, you mean descended from those planters originally brought over in the 1600s, who lived in the big house, as it was called. The local big house was always where the Anglo-Irish lived. So it's so, and with the Protestant background and sort of, but still being, as people said, more Irish than the Irish themselves. I mean, there's so many layers and layers of understanding and misunderstanding that we've had to navigate just based on that. And often going back to Ulysses and going back to Joyce to try and balance that and figure it out,
Wow.
I don't know. You could probably speak more to that.
Yeah, I completely agree with that, and I agree that yes, at times Joyce does provide answers there.
That's amazing. Yeah, he really seems to like Joyce really did like encapsulate it all, and not just in the way of like, oh, like you're an author, so you have lots of characters in your book, but like the example he used was like the citizen in the Cyclops episode, where it's like the citizen exists, but he has that like one-eyed like nature, right? So he only has this thing. But the wild thing is that Joyce can represent that in a way that like no matter which perspective you come to that character, you can like read that character as like yourself from your own understanding. You know what I mean? So like I am like personally disgusted by that sort of nationalism, but if the citizen was like a character, or if the citizen was like a Joyce reader, he could read it and be like, yes, this is great, and like it's just all there.
Absolutely. And the capacity to identify at any given moment in time, depending on your mood and who's reading and what's in it on the day, to be able to find ourselves in each of the characters. That's the lovely idea of the notion of the very specific in the universal. Because there are days you're walking and there's absolute compassion and empathy and understanding of being Bloom. The outsider who's never going to be the insider. He was an outsider from the get-go, just by nature of his mother not being the Jew. It was his father who was the Jew. Mm-hmm. So he's not a Jew and he's not an Irishman. And he's all about preaching love. And that whole scene with the citizen, it's like, come on, all you need is love sort of thing. It's like, let's invoke the four evangelists. Who are they? Paul, Ringo, George, and, but at the same time, it's like, and as an Irish person, I know, reading The Citizen, it's like, I've been that citizen. I've been that blinded by my absolute belief that I understood everything and not getting the most obvious thing that's there in my face. And then, in a very Irish way, trying to find their peace over, like, will you have a drink? Go on, have a drink. I mean, that's so Irish. It's like, and wasn't it The Citizen that was trying to buy him a drink or didn't buy him a drink, or I forget who was trying to buy who a drink. But there was the whole thing when they're in the pub.
Yeah.
And
I feel like the main thing that always stands out to me is how they like expect Bloom to get them a drink because they think he's won like from the race.
Right.
And
That's
he
it.
like didn't.
And he's clueless because he doesn't get it. And in the meantime, they're like, would you not just buy a drink? Because that's it's a basic unwritten rule in Irish pubs where you go in and you say, who's up for a drink? I mean, you just do. That's what you have to do. And things have changed a little in the last 10, 20 years. But even when I was growing up and I was first going to pubs, if you walk in, there's only a few people there. You sort of offer around the drink. It's the assumption. You never buy one for yourself. Bloom didn't even want a drink to start with, but it's that whole thing. And they're thinking, well, you not only are you being rude, but you also just won a whole bunch of money. And he has no idea that they think that. And so all the misunderstandings of the human condition, and he's just, preaching Jesus, the Jews preaching Jesus, and the whole thing is like, it's brilliant. I don't know.
No,
I mean, that's why I love it. It's like Tad says, it's so specifically Irish. And at the same time, there is that absolute universality in all of it. But what makes it fun is when you recognize the Irish bits and go, oh, yeah. And that's what I was telling about my daughter when she was reading it. And sometimes there'd be a group of, 20 people getting all caught down these little rabbit warrens of how to explain a phrase, a turn of phrase. And then my daughter would jump in and say, but that's what my grandmother says all the time. It just means this. And everyone go, oh, right. It was that obvious, And then sometimes, and someone else might jump in and say, oh, you're right. It's just a reversal of, some old idiom from some little village in the west of Ireland. And it's just been reversed. And he's just playing with, like I said, this old saying or dicton, as the Irish word is. And a child will recognize.
That's the beauty of Joyce, though, is that it's just so pregnant. Do you know what I mean? Every line is pregnant. It can mean 10 things.
And usually does.
And he usually does.
Or if it doesn't, we can make it. Like, it has the space for us to say what we want through it, I feel.
Like Roscoe or something, yeah.
Have you thought of a favorite Dubliner story, Siobhan? I think I figured out my answer.
Oh, what is your answer?
Well, I was going to say, it's always, I feel so basic, but it really is The Dead for me. But I think it's because I've started a little tradition that I'm surprised my friends have actually bought in, but we have a tradition now of like doing a dramatic reading on like January 6th, Epiphany, when it takes place, and we'll like make the cast list and everyone has their like character to play and that sort of thing. And it has just been like,
that's cute.
It's quite fun actually. But yeah, I think it's, it's a fun thing to do with friends as well, but also I think like hearing different people read for different characters and like getting to read for different characters myself has like, it's a very slow process. It's only once a year, so it'll take a while to get through all of them. But, it gives you that different, I don't know, it makes you realize like how real each and every single one of them are. But
did you know that was Leonard Cohen's favorite too?
I didn't. Wow. What can I say?
There's a beautiful interview. I'll send you the interview because he talks about, those lines at the end where, snow was falling all over Ireland, those beautiful last lines. And Leonard Cohen talks about how that's so Montreal, and that describes Montreal so beautifully, right? When you think about it, right? Especially those snowfalls, not the first one, not the last one, but those ones like last Sunday where it went from rain to snow and suddenly it was that. And there's a beautiful interview I'll send you with Leonard Cohen where he talks about that. And he says that's so Montreal. It's like being up at the cemetery on Mount Royal or something. And
No,
it,
well,
but
but
it's
you get also within that, okay,
Mhm.
you get the two sides of the coin, because he says snow is general all over Ireland. So in other words, nobody knows, like, it's a beautiful image, right? But what he's really kind of saying, I mean, the way I've taken that is that, like, nobody knows what the hell's going on. Do you know what I mean? And
right.
that's what the snow is. It's like covering up everything, and you know what I mean? And oh, isn't that nice? Well, not if you look under it, maybe. Do you know what I mean? And that's the thing about Joyce, is that he does kind of, you know, he shows the underbelly, you know,
Mhm.
of the world. He really does. Do you know what I mean?
For sure.
And like, I mean, I love the dead as well. It's a really great thing. Yeah.
It hits me I feel like I'm always so surprised at like how he gets from the beginning to the end. I don't know. It's just like such a range of like tones and moods.
Yeah.
It always,
And you don't see
always,
it coming.
no, even I'm reading it, like I've read it so many times, and still when they get back to the hotel room, I'm like, what?
I know. And it's like, it's so, I mean, I know my heart breaks for that poor young fella out in the rain, and for her, and for Gabriel, and all of them. And you're just like, oh, and they've just come home and they've gone through, and there's that minute. What's the minute where they go by Nelson's Pillar, and there's something, was it Nelson's Pillar they go by, or there's something about the statue where they're coming home that doesn't exist anymore.
Oh, the horse that like his
Right.
uncle or whatever used to have that goes
Yes.
around this statue. Yeah,
right.
that was one of those that my Irish literature professor was like, can anyone guess what this represents?
Yeah.
Like, it's not subtle.
And you know that they have a dead dinner every year in Wynn's Hotel in Dublin, where you were. So again, on the 6th, which is, it's called Little Christmas in Ireland, because it's women's Christmas. So Little Christmas was January 6th, which was the one day a year traditionally where women did nothing, no housework. And traditionally women would go to the pub. It was the one day of the year where women would take over the pubs, and the men had to cook dinner and look after the kids and stuff. So it's called Little Christmas or Women's Christmas. And so but that's sort of irrelevant to this, but on that day in Wynn's Hotel, which I believe features somewhere in Ulysses, it's one of the stops, every year up until COVID, there'd be a dead dinner where people dress just like they do on Bloomsday, but they have the dead dinner and everyone eats the food and has the speech. Like Gabriel will get up and give his talk, and you know, and it's a wonderful tradition that all the Joyceans are a part of. But again, somewhat more, I think, arguably represented by the Anglo-Irish community than the rest. I don't know. Tad, have you been to those dinners?
I've never been to one.
Nor have I.
So
They're quite fun.
that's something for us to do, Shiv.
Yeah.